Hello, we're going to be in Ezekiel 8 through 11 today, which is really one vision. A vision that has caused commentators great problems because Ezekiel is caught up from Babylon and transported to Jerusalem and sees some very detailed things, even as far as the particular names of some elders who are involved in the idolatry. It's about 14 months now from the date of chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. So about 14 months have elapsed. Ezekiel has gone through his many symbolic acts of laying on his side so many days for Israel and so many days for Judah. And now the elders of Judah, this book is very difficult, whether it's speaking about, when it says the elders of Israel, it seems to mean all the Jews. And when it says Judah, it seems to mean those of Judah. The distinction between the northern 10 tribes and the southern 2 tribes is somewhat blurred in Ezekiel, though it's still there in some passages. Now, there are going to be 4 examples of the terrible idolatry that's occurring in the city of Jerusalem. And this is to assure the Jews in exile of the reason for God's judgment to fall on the city and the temple. For you see, when the temple was finally overtaken, and all of the promises that God made, like to David in 2 Samuel 7, were suddenly null and void. And all those great statements about, I will cause my name to dwell here forever, I will never let this city fall, all of those were suddenly abrogated. And the Jews needed a theological reason why, and a reaffirmation that the covenant would be restored. And Ezekiel will give both of those before his series of messages are through. Let's look then at verse 1 of chapter 8. Now it came about in the 6th year, on the 5th day of the 6th month, as I was sitting in the house with the elders of Judah sitting before me. Well, that shows something of the preeminence of this man. He was already listened to, and yet they didn't fully believe all that he said. Maybe they were trying to make excuses or rationales why this shouldn't happen, and Ezekiel is going to confirm they will. They're still planning on going home very soon, and Ezekiel says, no, that's not going to happen that way. And I looked, and behold, a likeness as the appearance of a man. Now here's this likeness again. It's not like a man, but as close as he can get is a man. And so it's going to be a repeat of some of this visionary language that says, I just can't really tell you what I saw, but boy, it was really something. From his loins downward there was the appearance of fire, and from his loins upward the appearance of brightness, like the appearance of glowing metal. This is very much like chapter 1, 26 and 27. It's the appearance of God himself in chapter 1. This seems to be more of an angelic messenger, and yet the brightness of the glory of God is still there. Now, and he stretched out a form of a hand. It's not a real hand, but as close as he can get, okay? And caught me by the lock of the head. That's the only place in the Bible a prophet is caught up by the lock of the head. And the Spirit lifted me up between heaven and earth and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem. Now his predictions are so specific of what's happening in the temple area and the people involved that some say he was actually taken there physically. I don't know if it's a vision or he was literally transported. I just don't know. But whatever it was done by God. Now notice where it mentions then, to the entrance of the north gate. Now if you look down in verse 5, the north gate and the altar gate are the same thing. It seems to be the new entrance that was built as a royal entrance for the king to come from his palace to the temple. So it was a very important entrance. It was also the place where sacrifices were killed. And you might want to see Leviticus 1:11. Very predominant gate. Okay? Of the inner court. Now he's not in the outer court. He's where the priests were. And where the seat of the idol of jealousy, which provokes jealousy, was located. Now what in the world is that? Well, obviously it was an image of something. Now some have said it was a image of one of these gods that are going to be mentioned. Some say it's the image of Astarte or Astaroth that is mentioned in the parts of Kings, 2 Kings 21:7, and even down as far as the time of Josiah, 2 Kings 23:6. Exactly what image it was, we're not sure. But it was obviously an idolatrous image right there in the middle of Yahweh's temple. And it says the temple of jealousy. Jealousy means to acquire things, and whether it's a fertility idea or a materialistic idea, I'm not sure. But it caused the God of Israel to be jealous because it was his temple, and he's not going to share it with some other god who is not a god at all. Now, notice it mentions then, after that abomination, behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, like the appearance which I saw on the plain. Now, that goes back to chapter 1, that great appearance of the chariot throne. And then that same idea is in chapter 3, verse 22, where he sees the glory of the Lord standing in the plain. Okay, so it's the continuity of the same God and the same vision is the idea here. Now let's go down a bit further when it says, then he brought me to the entrance of the court, and then I looked, and behold, a hole in the wall. Now the idea here, he's going to dig through this hole and find a secret entrance. He's going to be walking into a secret cultic rite. And on the walls of this room, where the elders are all there with their instruments of censers and sacrifice and all of that, are going to be reliefs. Now the word here in Hebrew seems to mean that they're going to be not just pictures, but carved out reliefs, bas reliefs of these animals. Now, so I entered and looked, behold, every form of creeping thing and beast and detestable thing, with all the idols of the house of Israel, were carved on the walls all around it. And there were all the elders there. Now that's the terrible thing. This is the leadership that was involved in this. Now this seems to be more of an Egyptian form, because they're the ones that have the scarabs and the half-animal gods. It reminds you a whole lot of Romans chapter 1, where it says they turned the image of God into the form of snakes and birds and fish. And that's the idea of what we have here. Some have said if the idol of jealousy is Astarte, that's Canaanite, and this one seems to be Egyptian, and a little bit later the next one's going to be Babylonian. Notice where it says, and standing in front of them were 70 elders. Now 70 is the number of organization. It's a round number, and it would simply mean most of the elders. Not every one of them, but most of them were participating. And notice one of them is named. Now this name occurs several times, but this is the one who is the son of Shaphan, and he was a leader he was the Secretary of State under Josiah. So it shows how far even these godly families have come. Well, it's been a terrible slide to idolatry. Notice in verse 12, they begin to make excuses. This same practice that was done in the temple, each man in a room of his carved images. They had taken what they did in the temple and they'd taken it home and had their own private worship chambers, either in home or in local areas. And that's the idea here. For they say, the Lord does not see us, the Lord has forsaken the land. Now they say is a recurrent theme of Ezekiel. He's answering all the supposed questions, or he's at least revealing the inner thoughts of these people as they thought about the religious practices of their day. You might want to write these down. Chapter 9, verse 9, chapter 11, 3 and 15, chapter 12, verse 22 and 27, chapter 18, verses 2 and 25, chapter 33, verses 10, 24, 30, chapter 35, verse 12, and chapter 37, verse 11 are all places where he says they say or they think and that kind of thing. Now here they're assuming two things. Number one, they're impugning the omnipotence of God, saying God doesn't see. He's just left and gone away somewhere. He's forgotten the land. He's broken his covenant. He's not trustworthy. Now here is all their rationalization for their idolatry. These are the leaders now, I'm telling you. Now here's the next abomination. He brought me to the entrance of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north, and behold, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. Now Tammuz is a Babylonian deity. We can't be real dogmatic on the origins of this particular deity, but we know some things. He apparently is the Sumerian god of agriculture, and he followed the seasons of the year, so he would die in the heat of the summer and be resurrected in the spring. Now, supposedly, this is exactly the same as the Greek, Adonis, who was loved by Aphrodite, and he was killed by a wild boar and had to go to the underworld for part of the year, and the goddess of love mourned him, so part of the worship was women mourning this god being gone. It turned into a fertility god. It's known in Babylon as Dumuze. And the reason for that is, this title is, the name Tammuz is one of the summer month names when supposedly this god died. It's very similar to the Egyptian cult of Isis and Osiris, and very similar to that. It's even mentioned by its Babylonian name in Isaiah 17, 10 and 11. So here the women are in the temple weeping for this fertility god of the Babylonians. Unbelievable, isn't it? And then look at verse 16, the final one. And they brought me to the inner court of the Lord's house, and behold, the entrance of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, it's right by the shrine itself, were 25 men with their backs to the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, and they were prostrating themselves eastward toward the sun. Well, here's sun worship right in the very heart of the temple. It's ironical that they have their backs turned to the temple, which symbolizes they're turning their backs away from Yahweh and beginning to worship the sun. This warning is made about this in Deuteronomy 4:19, and it's mentioned, this sun worship is mentioned in 2 Kings 23:11. And so it has a real connection with Egypt, who worshiped the sun. That Pharaoh was considered to be a son of the sun. And of course later on in Persia, Zoroastrianism worshiped the sun and fire. So we have a real connection there. Now, notice in verse 17 the last little phrase, for behold, they are putting a twig to their nose. Now there's been several possibilities here. First of all, this we found in Assyrian, now not Babylonian, but Assyrian bas reliefs. This is a part of the worshiping of the sun, holding flowers up in front of you, or something like that, putting something to your nose. Now the rabbis and also Rashi and Kimchi say that it's a way of talking about God's nose, and that the stench of their idolatry was abhorrent to God, like the fragrant aroma of sacrifices rose to God. Well, the abhorrent aroma of their idolatry rose to God. The Septuagint translators make this a sign of contempt and mockery toward God. Now, which it is, we're just not really sure. Now, notice in chapter 9. Chapter 9 is really an amplification of the judgment that's predicted in chapter 8, verse 18. Then he cried out in my hearing with a loud voice, saying, draw near, O executioners of the city, each with his destroying weapon in his hand. Now, this seems to be angelic destroyers. They're mentioned in the book of Daniel, chapter 4, verses 13, 17, and 23. It's the same kind of destroying angel that came in the Passover, the plague on Egypt. So it's a angel in the service of God. Now, this idea in verse 2, behold, 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate in the north, each with a shadowing weapon in his hand. Now, this is the same location as the place of the image, chapter 8, verse 3, and the place of the weeping women, chapter 8, verse 14. This shadowing weapon may be just a war club, we learn from Jeremiah 51:20. And one of the men was clothed in linen with a writing case at his loins. Now, the writing case would be an Egyptian loan word. It would have styluses and ink and maybe some tablets or parchment. And apparently the idea he's dressed in linen means that he is an angel of a higher rank, or an angel in control, the recording angel. And notice it says, and the glory of the Lord went up from the cherubs. Now, we're not sure exactly what this is talking about. Because of chapter 10's description, much like the chariot throne of chapters 1, and I think the cherubs here are not the cherubs over the Ark of the Covenant, but probably the cherubs on this portable throne chariot that Ezekiel saw by the river Kibar in chapter 1. But I can't be real dogmatic about that. Notice in verse 4, he's going to put a mark on their foreheads. Now, the mark here is very similar to the mark of Cain in Genesis 4:15, was put on Cain's forehead. We have the same kind of symbolism in Revelation chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. It is interesting to me to note that the mark here is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the Taw, which means mark or sign. Now, in current Hebrew, it's not written as it was in ancient Hebrew. The ancient Hebrew was an X or a cross. Many of the early church fathers see it as a Christian symbol here, even in the Old Testament. I'm not sure we can go that far, but it's obvious in the book of Revelation that God knows His and marks them out. Judgment was not indiscriminate, but discriminate. And I think that's important that we know there were some faithful people left, though not many of them. And notice in verse 6 it says, so they started with the elders who are before the temple. Now you might well see 1 Peter 4:17. Those who have great opportunity, those who have great light, also have great responsibility. Judgment begins with the household of God. It begins here with the priest. That is obvious. And there in verse 8, the prophet gets concerned because everybody is dying. There are not many with the mark on them, and he's afraid the whole promise to Israel will be wiped out. And so he prays for them here, as he does again in chapter 11, verse 13. The severity of the angel is seen here. The soft heart of the prophet underneath that hard exterior, you see him pleading for his people. He had a love for them that the other prophets did not have. That other false prophets, I mean. Now notice where it says, but as for me, my eyes will have no pity, nor shall I spare, but I will bring their conduct upon their heads. You might want to see chapter 8, verse 27. Now, notice in verse 10. Then I looked, and behold, the expanse was over their heads of the cherubim. Now here's the description again of this portable chariot throne. We saw it in chapter 1, verses 13 through 25. It's going to be repeated here almost exactly, but with a few variations. Notice it mentions the cloud of glory in verse 3. This is the Shekinah cloud that was present at the Exodus, present at the dedication of Solomon's temple, present at the tabernacle. I think it's the cloud that God spoke out of at Jesus' baptism and the Mount of Transfiguration. It's also the cloud that caught him up from the Mount of Olives. It's the cloud that's going to bring him back. It's the same cloud that the Son of Man, which is Jesus, rode before the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7:13. It's the cloud of glory. The temple was filled with it. Look at verse 4. Now, beginning in verse 6, we start calling these figures cherubim. Now, I hadn't called them cherubim before. Why? Well, maybe, although Ezekiel was trained as a priest, maybe he hadn't been in the inner shrine before this, and he saw the pictures of them on the walls of the temple, inside of the temple now, where the priests were, and maybe he recognized them as what he saw on the river Kibar, and just now does he make that identification. Look at verse 15. Look at verse 20. He never made that identification in chapter 1, but now he's calling them cherubs. Now, the cherubs, their appearance differs from time to time. The Ark of the Covenant in Exodus 20 is described a little different. The cherubs in Ezekiel are somewhat different from the cherubs in the later part of Ezekiel, verses 40 through 48. They're different from the living creatures of Revelation 4, so we can't lock down these visions real tight. But there's some fluidity here. Now, the coals of fire, remember I told you that the chariot throne of God was formed by the pair of the wings of the four creatures. And in the middle was this burning coal, symbolic of God's justice or judgment or purity. Now Isaiah, a coal was taken from that and touched his lips to purify him. He and these same coals are going to be thrown on the city for judgment. And so we have that idea here. In verse 12 is another expansion of chapter 1, where in chapter 1 the eyes were around the outside of the double wheels. But here, they're on the backs, the wings, and the hands of the cherubs also. Now this speaks of the omniscience of God, all-knowingness of God, which of course counteracts those earlier false claims that God doesn't know what we're doing, doesn't it? Now, notice in verse 14, it says, and one of the faces, of the four faces, the first face was that of a cherub. Now that is a change from chapter 1, verse 10. In chapter 1, verse 10, it is an ox, and here it's a cherub. Some say there's just been a scribal error. Others say that cherub's face looked like the face of an ox. Well, that's possible. It may be a human form with that oxen face we're talking about. Maybe the faces that looked into the ark were oxen faces. We're just not really sure. Okay? The cherubs rose up, and the living beings that I saw by the river Kibar. And here's the mobility again of this chariot throne. Notice in verse 19 that God is leaving the temple. The glory of the Lord hovered over them. And this is going to be a very significant thing. God's going to move from apparently the Ark of the Covenant to his portable chariot. And then he's going to move from the chariot, he's going to move out of the temple area and hover over the gate, the threshold. And then he's going to move from the gate to the hills east. And the inference is he goes all the way to Babylon where Ezekiel saw him. And so here is God, really it's riding Ichabod across the temple. The glory has departed. And he's going with the exiles who are going to form the nucleus of his new community that will return in so many years. And so in chapter 40, and 41 through 3, the glory returns from the east to the temple in Ezekiel's visions of a new temple. And so here we have a fundamental truth that God is leaving. Now the rabbis say he stayed on the Mount of Olives for 3 years or so, 3.5 years I think the rabbis say, to see if the people would repent, and they would not, and so judgment came. Let's see. Okay, chapter 11. Moreover, the Spirit lifted me and brought me to the east gate of the Lord's house, which faced east. And behold, there were 25 men at the entrance. Now these do not seem to be connected with the 25 men worshiping the sun. These are political leaders. You might see Jeremiah 26:10, for this was the place of public meetings. He even names one of these, Jezana. Now, there are 3 other men by that name but have different fathers, so you be careful not to identify him with the 3 others, okay? And another man's mentioned, we don't know who he is at all, but he's called the leaders of the people. Now, most of the other leaders were taken into exile in 597, but there were a few of them left, and so these must have been lay leaders, because 10,000 of the real nobility are already gone. And so the people who took over the leadership roles are there having a meeting, and look what's going to happen. And he said to me, Son of man, these are the men who devise iniquity and give evil advice to the city. Well, this seems to refer to their view of everything's going to be all right. Don't get upset. Babylon's going to be defeated. You don't have to worry. Peace, safety, security. You might want to see Jeremiah 21, 8 through 10, where the same thing is proclaimed. Who say, Is not the time near to build houses? This city is the pot, and we are the flesh. Now, until you read this whole chapter, you don't know what they're saying. They're saying, if I could just paraphrase it quickly, those who were taken in captivity, they're the guilty ones. God's judgment fell on them. But those of us who are left, we're the blessed ones. And we're the choice ones. We're the chosen ones. And God's going to bless us and build us into a great nation. And all the promises God has are ours. We are the chosen ones. They are the rejected ones. Now, you see what they're trying to say? They're trying to say that this first deportation is all the judgment. And Ezekiel's going to say, no, that's not true. You're not the favored ones. In reality, you're the condemned ones, because the ones who have been taken in exile, their children are going to return. Your children are going to die. Woo, boy, I tell you what. Therefore prophesy against them, Son of man, and say, The Spirit of the Lord fell upon me, and he said to me, Say, Thus saith the Lord, You think, house of Israel, for I know your thoughts. Now, he's talking about the house of Israel here, but he's talking to what's left of Judah. So that's how those two phrases are kind of mixed here. Notice in verse 7 it says, You are slain. Well, that may be sacrifices, or it may be the righteous ones that they killed who opposed their political views. We're just not sure. Notice in verse 10 it says, I'll judge you to the borders of Israel. Then in verse 11, to the borders of Israel. Now, some think that means as far as the borders. In other words, judgment will fall on the whole land. But I really think it refers to 2 Kings 25, 18 through 21, where Zedekiah tried to flee out of the city and escape and got caught and was taken to Nebuchadnezzar II at Riblah, and his eyes were put out. That's what I think it's really referring to. Let's see. Notice in verse 12. But have acted according to the ordinances of the nations around you. They succumbed to peer pressure. They wanted to be just like the nations. They wanted to have their gods instead of following Yahweh. And boy, they did too. And they paid the price. Just as God took the Amorites out of the land because of their abomination, God's going to take his people out of the land because of it. Verse 13. Now it came about, I prophesied, that Peltilah, son of Berniah, died. Now this seems to confirm the prophecy. Now when Jeremiah told them, Ezekiel told this back in Babylon, the word of this man's death had not reached them yet. But when it did reach them, it was another sign that this was a true prophet of God. Now, notice it says in verse 14, Go far from the Lord, this land has been given to us as a possession. Now that's related to verse 3. And it seems to be them saying, well, God, your judgment fall on those exiles. The land belongs to us now, and we're gonna do good here. That's the idea. Okay? Notice where God speaks in verse 16. I was a sanctuary for them for a little while in the countries where they have gone. And here's the great hope, that God was with them in Babylon. That he wasn't limited to Palestine, but he could move, and his compassion drew him even out of the place he caused his name to dwell, Jerusalem, and it pulled his heart toward the exiles, where he would build his covenant renewal with them. Notice in verse 19 this great truth. I shall give them one heart. This seems to speak of a reunification of Judah and Israel. And I shall put a new spirit within them, and I shall take the flesh of stone, that means their unrepentant, stiff-necked hardness of heart, and give them a heart of flesh. That means they're going to be responsive to me. Now this is very much like the new covenant of Jeremiah 31 through 34. It's mentioned several times in Ezekiel. In chapter 18:31, he says to them, make yourself a new heart and a new spirit. So there's man's responsibility. But again in chapter 36:26, it says, I will give you a new heart and a new spirit. Now here's the paradox of God's sovereignty and man's freedom. In everything spiritual, God's initiative always comes. And yet man is to respond. And we see that here in the use of this phrase. 2 times God's going to give it. Once man must do it for himself. Notice in verse 20 the covenant phrase, my people, and I will be their God. And there's the truth, the covenant will be restored. They needed to hear that because all they were holding on to was gone. Their Davidic promises of a king were gone. Their promise of Jerusalem as God's seat was gone. The temple was destroyed. They needed to hear more than anything that God was still their covenant God and that He would bring them back. Now, verse 22 and 23 is the idea again of God's glory leaving the temple and moving east to the mountains, and the inference is He'll move farther than that. And then verse 25, we pick up chapter 8, verse 1. When the vision is over, he goes back and explains all that he saw in detail to those elders of Judah who were sitting in his house in chapter 8, verse 1. How long the vision took, whether it was momentary or whether it was hours or days, we just don't know. But he recorded all of it to those elders so they would know what was going to happen. You see, those people in exile were still trusting in the temple. They were still trusting in Jerusalem. And both Jeremiah and Ezekiel had to say, whoa now, God has abrogated the covenant. He's going to start all over. The temple will be destroyed. The city will fall. Don't trust in the city. Don't trust in the temple. Trust in God. And here's the beginning of the individual responsibility. It's so characteristic of the New Testament. It begins in Jeremiah and Ezekiel. It's amplified in the New Testament. There's still a corporate responsibility, yes, but the individual becomes the focus, and we see it here beginning in this as the cultic aspect is put down, and the individual aspect of faith is lifted up, as the mark on the forehead shows. Well, I've enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place next week.